Learning a language is the best thing you can do for building discipline. Is that a fact? I have no idea. But when I look at my ability to build discipline and my ability to delay gratification, language learning and my passion for it had a huge impact on it. And the reason I believe that was so true is because language learning is one of the few skills like, fitness and like learning an instrument that takes nothing more than consistency and dedication over a long period of time. However, with language learning, because we don't often get to speak with a native speaker of that target language unless you are afforded that opportunity, we don't get to really practice our skills or see how far we're going as we continue to progress. We don't get to see the abs poking through very often. So there are very long periods of time while learning a language where you feel like you're making zero progress, but the only way to kind of get through that point is to continue demonstrating consistency and things like that. However, there are ways in which we can increase the efficiency of learning a language and getting the most out of the time we are spending with that language. And today I will be talking about my language learning routine that has enabled me to go from failing language classes in high school and thinking that I could never learn a language to speaking at an upper intermediate level in Russian and an intermediate level in Spanish. Still working on that one. But it has enabled me to get to a high level where I can converse comfortably all across a wide range of topics. And most importantly, meet people from other cultures and utilize the languages, which is the biggest thing in which I focus on is the utilization and the ability to travel to a place and learn a language. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about my story with language learning. When I was a kid, I grew up in a town that had primarily Spanish speakers. I was the minority at my school and was surrounded by Spanish speakers, and I always almost felt left out. I always envied them and wanted to be able to speak the language. So I, like most kids in school, enrolled in Spanish classes and tried to learn the language the traditional way, studied grammar, studied a bunch of words, and when I had the opportunity to use them with my friends that spoke the language, I was always very frustrated and left me feeling like I could never learn a language. So if you feel like you can never learn a language, I get it. I've been there. However, I promise if you demonstrate the consistency and do the things that we're going to talk about a little bit later, you can incrementally increase your ability to speak and converse in your target language. So after I was upset and disgruntled about my inability to learn a language, I kind of let it go for a very long time, right? Once I joined the military, I got a roommate that I lived with who spoke Spanish. So once again, picked it up. I remember one night, after a party in the barracks, I got back in there at 1 a.m. or whatever, and I jumped on the computer and I spent like $600 on Rosetta Stone, right? Never once used it, never got a benefit from it, failed all the goals I had in regards to being able to speak with my roommate fluently, right? And now looking back, it's not a matter of my ability to learn at the time. I just had no idea how to actually learn a language, right? When we're in school and they drill the grammar books and they drill this and that, they test you on your ability to say the right ending or use the right gender in Spanish or whatever the language is. They're not teaching you to converse in the language. And a lot of times, at least in my case, it became more uh, systematic. I was focused on passing these arbitrary tests instead of focusing on what really matters to me, at least, and that is the ability to converse and meet people and utilize the target language. So, fast forward within my Army career, volunteered for Special Forces, ended up in the Special Forces qualification course. And at the end of that course, you have to learn a language, right? So at that point, I did have a little bit of an unfair advantage, right? A little boost in my language learning journey. and I spent 6 months in a classroom, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. with a native speaker of that target language. And the entire thing, or the only thing standing between me and going to a team, which is what I wanted to do for many years, was my ability to learn language. So motivation was at an all-time high and got to a pretty decent level during that time. However, the biggest thing that I took away during my time in the Q course, or during the language portion of the Q course, was developing my own routine. The big thing I always tell guys is everyone has a specific routine that fits within their day, that fits within their lifestyle, that is going to enable them to first stay consistent and ultimately get the results in regards to learning a language. So trying to jump on someone else's might not work for you. So I hope with today's video and going over my routine in depth, you'll be able to get some nuggets that you can incorporate in yours, figure out what works for you, and ultimately get the results you are looking for. So after graduating the Q course and getting to a team, it's not an environment where language is a priority. I always thought going special forces and being a Green Beret and they speak other languages, that it would be something where you have to maintain a very high level. You would be, so to say, fluent. However, I learned that for most guys and the regiment as a whole, it's not much of a priority. You get a couple weeks of language training once per year. You take a test, and other than that, it is completely on your own. So I knew if I wanted to get my language score from decent to good, then I would have to put in the work necessary to make that happen. And I started doing a lot more research, stumbled across pages like Steve Kaufman, pages or books like Fluent Forever, Fluent in 3 months, things like that. And I started taking bits and pieces of these language learning methodologies and implementing them in my own routine. But before we dive too deep, I want to go over some language learning methods or things that we can implement into our routine. And you're going to hear me saying later on that will help you get a better picture. Number one is sentence mining. This is my favorite technique to start off in a language. Often our goal with learning a language is learning to speak, and sentence mining is the act of taking full sentences that are ideally useful, and I'll touch on that in just a second, applicable content, and learning those. With this, we obviously learn vocabulary, but we do it in a way that introduces us to how the words are actually used in context. We also learn grammar by noticing how the ending of words in different contexts and different forms of conjugation are used in different contexts as well. Also, sentence mining puts us in a position to use some of the phrases when opportunities arise, which fuels our motivation and continue learning, right? You'll hear me, I'm going to talk about an app called Mango Languages, which is how I now start off in new languages, and something that I recommend doing, and I'll talk about what to look for in those apps. But a lot of times we talk about things like Duolingo, and one of the reasons why I believe Duolingo is not the most beneficial app to use and doesn't lead to a high level of proficiency or the ability to converse in a language is it doesn't provide usable knowledge. It doesn't provide usable sentences that we can mine, learn the grammar, and develop our ability to speak out of it. I know guys have these 3-year streaks with Duolingo, but in my opinion, in my experience, utilizing these apps, they're good for getting started. They're not good for getting to a high level in a language. But sentence mining is a huge part that I like to use starting out, and is a huge part of what I use on a daily basis in regards to my language learning routine. Next is spaced repetition. So spaced repetition doesn't just apply to languages, it applies to quite a bit, but this is a learning technique that involves studying flashcards at specific intervals. The more the more difficult a flashcard is, or if we tell the system that we get it wrong more often, the more often we will see it. As we continue to memorize the content or tell it, the software that we're getting better, the frequency of reviewing that specific card becomes less often until it is committed to our long-term memory. This, in conjunction with sentence mining, is a powerful method to get past the beginning stages of learning languages, right? So whenever I was in language school, I came across a book and now an application called Fluent Forever, and he is all about sentence mining. That's where you take usable phrases. Well, Fluent Forever isn't the most usable phrases, so don't hold me to that one. But that's where you take usable phrases and you put them in a spaced repetition system, and you study those phrases until you learn the vocabulary and how they're used in context, and you build your vocabulary, your ability to speak through that. I believe that is a great way to get started because we can build a very solid foundation in the language in a very short period of time. And in my experience going through the qualification course and implementing these, this is something that helped me tremendously. And I saw a visible boost in my ability to speak, especially when comparing to some of the other individuals in my class that weren't utilizing those types of techniques. Some resources for sentence binding. One is that Mango Languages. Fluent Forever is another. Babbel is pretty good. These all have spaced repetition systems integrated into there. However, once you progress to comprehensible input, which I'll get to in just a second, I do recommend switching to an app, a platform like Anki. Anki is a platform that provides a little bit more customization, and this again is great for progressing past that beginner stage when you can start controlling what topics you want to cover, what things you want to go into, and stuff like that. Right. Now, once you get past those beginning stages, I jumped into, and this is the biggest thing in regards to what boosted my ability to learn a language, and that is comprehensible input. So after I have spent a time with the above two methods, I then begin to explore the world of comprehensible input. This is when we listen to content, preferably from native speakers. This is important. This is also something that Duolingo doesn't do a great job of. It's kind of like canned speech. It's perfect. The setting is ideal. There's no reverberation, things like that. So whenever we try to compare that or transfer that into our ability to speak in conversation where we're out in public and people don't pronounce words clearly or maybe cut off endings, it becomes very difficult. So comprehensible input, I like to use podcasts or other methods where people are speaking in a more natural tone, obviously tailored to the level, and we'll get to that in just a second. For example, I may take a 5-minute video which covers topics I'm interested in, read through the transcript, which makes it more comprehensible, right? There are many tools for getting the transcript, and I'll cover that in a little bit, and listen to that audio many times or and often over a few days until I understand 90 to 100% of what is being said. I'm a firm believer that simply listening to our target language will not help us reach our goals. It must be comprehensible, right? You've probably heard this in the past where you can just listen to the language and over time you're going to start assimilating with the specific sounds you're hearing and things like that, right? I've tried it. In my experience, didn't work at all. What did work is when I listened to content that is slightly above my level. So I understand, 50 to 60% of what is being said, and I can get the gist of what they're talking about and start to fill in those blanks with my ability to notice, right? I prefer to start with content. Again, 50 to 60% is kind of that sweet spot. This means in the beginning stages of like jumping into comprehensible input, the content needs to be relatively easy and more suited for beginners in the language. As we continue to grow our vocabulary, staying up with our spaced repetition system, if you are doing that, or if you're just doing comprehensible input, maintaining that consistency on a daily basis, we develop the ability to listen to more complex information and really start to learn things through the language, which is when it becomes fun. Some resources I like for comprehensible input. Number one is going to be podcasts. There are many podcasts out there that do a great job speaking to particular levels. For Russian, I use Russian with Max, which is the Comprehensible Russian podcast. Very great. I've used it for many years. I'm pretty sure I've listened to it since episode 1. And then for Spanish is How to Spanish. They speak very clearly. But it's more natural conversation with two native speakers. In the beginning, again, it must be a podcast that uploads accurate transcripts with each episode so we can read through them and we can make that episode fully comprehensible, save words, phrases, whatever the case may be. And then as we progress, we can have more nuanced things outside of it. Once we get past that point and once we get past the initial phase of building that foundation and then jumping into comprehensible input on the speaking side, other than just speaking, I do like to integrate something called shadowing. I will actually start my speaking training by almost speaking to myself, right? This is essentially where we mimic the speech of a native speaker. I typically do this in the car while driving, so I don't look like an absolute psycho. But the important thing is to get our tongues used to speaking that language out loud. And the big thing with it is I try to copy their pace, I try to copy their intonation, I try to copy the accent total as closely as I can. And over time, we become a lot more natural with doing so, right? Then the last portion is going to be speaking as much as possible. Some resources I use for this, italki is probably the best one. There's like paid tutors on there that are relative, like pretty inexpensive. Tandem and HelloTalk, which is more like language exchange apps. I like italki because it's very straight to the point. I'd rather hire somebody that can focus on developing my language skill as opposed to just having random conversation. So my language learning routine. I first start by using an app called Mango Languages. This is an easy app to use that will get us introduced to the language without feeling overwhelmed, and also provides us with conversational content which can immediately apply to speaking opportunities. And then I for Spanish spent like 6 weeks learning it, 30-60 minutes a day. I didn't go through the entire course. I kind of used it until I got my foundation. I really wanted to dive into comprehensible input. So this is what Mango Languages looks like. They obviously have a phone application as well, which makes it super easy. So the way in which I recommend doing this is when you come in here every single day, you'll have your daily review, which is that spaced repetition system. You can go in here, you can start the review, and then you can tell the system how well you know those phrases and words, right? And then it has a bunch of different lessons that go over all kinds of different stuff. They're always adding stuff. So it is a great tool, and in my opinion is the best app to use to start learning a language. However, things like Babbel, Fluent Forever are also up there as well. I'm sure there's quite a few out there, and guys tend to get pretty married to their specific apps, just like I am with Mango. But I've had really good success with this, and I think it's very applicable to utilizing the language and getting past that surf, so to say, right? The big thing with those types of apps is don't get married to it and expect or outsource your progress in the language to the point where you expect to get to fluency or a high level in that language. Utilize these apps as a foundation builder to get those phrases so we can have quick conversations, we can get around in town. But if we want to get to the point where we're conversing on a wide range of topics and developing real relationships with native speakers of our target language, then we have to get to comprehensible input. So after that initial period, that's when I start to introduce that comprehensible input. And this is when I start listening to longer form content. An app called LingQ, or a platform called LingQ, is my preferred app, and they have short stories for quite a few languages, and these stories are designed for beginners with the simple speech exposing us to the authentic spoken languages, right? Within LingQ, and I'll show the app and how I use it in just a minute, after I have spent 4 to 6 weeks getting exposure to longer form content through the stories and things like that, and the beginner speech, I then begin to use podcasts. There are many podcasts for the majority of languages that people learn out there. But at the beginning of the week, I upload the transcript in the LingQ. And then throughout the week or the next session or two, I read through the transcript and save all of the words in the phrases that they're in. So I learn how to use it in context, right? And then I add that to my Anki deck if you want to do this. You don't have to do this portion of it. You can simply listen to it throughout the week, and that's currently what I'm doing because I don't have the time to dedicate with Anki or to Anki on a daily basis. So I just listen, and I'm still making progress in my language learning, especially my comprehension, right? This gives me long-term exposure to the words and a little bit deeper understanding. And if you're in a phase where you're maybe coming up on a test or whatever it is and you want to learn more rapidly, then utilizing the spaced repetition system at this point in conjunction with comprehensible input can be a very, very useful tool. But once you get to a certain point and you just need exposure to the language on a consistent basis, don't feel like you have to keep up with all of those things. Comprehensible input is ultimately going to be king. I then simply listen to the same episode every day throughout the week. I also study the flashcards, and then by the end of the week, I understand 90 to 100% of what is being said. So let me show you how I use LingQ. So this is LingQ on the desktop. They do have an app as well. They have pre-made lessons, news, all different, a whole bunch of channels. You can import YouTube videos, you can import transcripts. What I do is, this is for Spanish, and I go to the Patreon of the podcast of How to Spanish. I download their transcripts on a weekly basis, and then I will upload them into LingQ. And as we come into LingQ, if the words are white, that means we know them, or we've told the system that we know them. I've been doing this for several years at this point, so at a decent point. The yellow ones are words that we told the system that we don't quite know, kind of that new exposure, but we've been exposed to it. And then the blue words are words that are brand new to us. So these are words that the system has not shown us, and then we can either tell it if we know it, or we can save it as a link, and now we know that we've seen it before, and we can make that connection when it comes up again. So I read this throughout the week, and then I will listen to this same podcast oftentimes as I read in the morning, or while I'm driving to work, things like that. So when I got to a team, and again, I was in this environment that I wanted to continue progressing in my language capabilities, but did not have a whole lot of time. Like I said, it's not a very big priority there. I had a 45-minute drive, and once a week I would read through this transcript, and then on that 45-minute drive, I would just listen to that same podcast at least once per day. So on the way there, I would listen to it. Maybe sometimes on the way back, I would do the shadowing technique. Otherwise, I would just make sure I listen to that podcast, or at least half the podcast or a portion of it, 20 minutes or so, once per week. And doing this over that period of time with very little additional exposure to the language, I was able to get my language in my Russian skill from a 2, which is the ability to converse over a wide range of topics, but not very clearly. You don't understand all the points, kind of murky, to a 2+. 2+, you can converse at a pretty high level. However, you're still making, grammatical errors, and you're not speaking with a native accent, right? So got to a pretty high level, was able to utilize the language when I was deployed in various countries, and came across opportunities to speak it. Unfortunately, never got to use it super professionally, but it was just developing relationships with people that spoke the language. But this routine of simply listening to the podcast in the mornings as I drove, going through the transcripts, saving the words and phrases, putting those into a spaced repetition system like Anki, is really what propelled my language from lower levels to kind of that upper intermediate over a period of time. So again, biggest thing I recommend is to find a routine that you can, number one, stay consistent with, number two, demonstrate the discipline and you enjoy doing, so you're going to do it over that long period of time, and that fits within your specific schedule. Hope you can take something from this language learning routine, and if you use it and get some results, drop it down in the comments. Otherwise, I'll talk to you guys very soon.